The screen is dark, save for the flickering blue light of a dozen surveillance monitors. We see a close-up of a hand, heavy, expensive rings on the fingers, and dark, intricate ink of a soaring hawk disappearing under a silk sleeve. I didn't hire her to be a saint. I hired her because she was invisible. Zakai's voice overrubs the silence, thick with a gravelly, tired edge. But the cameras, they don't see what I see. They see a woman who knows too much about the dying, and not enough about the rules. On the center screen, Ifananya leans over the sleeping Aloan. She isn't checking a pulse. She is pressing a small, crushed leaf against the girl's temple, whispering words that aren't in any language Zakai recognizes. He leans in, the tattoos on his neck tensing as he narrows his eyes. "What are you doing to my daughter, Ifananya?" The estate sat atop the Seattle cliffs like a crown of glass and cold steel. Inside, the air was filtered, sterilized, and heavy with the scent of expensive lilies and failure. Zakai stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, the city lights reflecting off his sharp jawline. To the world, he was a titan of industry with a reach that touched every corner of the underground. To the small girl in the West Wing, he was just a ghost who smelled of sandalwood and sorrow. His daughter, Aloan, was the only thing his billions couldn't fix. Her lungs were failing, a slow collapse that the best surgeons in the country called idiopathic. In his world, unknown was synonymous with weakness. 3 months ago, Ifananya had arrived. She was a woman of few words, her eyes always cast downward, her hands scarred but steady. She was the only maid who didn't flinch at the ink on Zakai's skin or the armed men in the foyer. But silence, in Zakai's experience, was usually a cloak for a knife. 2 nights ago, he had the technicians bypass the security protocols. Now, every inch of Aloan's room was mapped in 4K resolution. He was looking for a betrayal. But as he watched the first feed, his breath hitched. Ifananya wasn't just cleaning. She was practicing a ghost medicine that looked far too much like a miracle. Before the story begins, let me know where you're watching from by commenting below. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Now, let's go deeper into this story. The hum of the digital servers was the only heartbeat in the room, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to pulse through the soles of Zakai's handmade leather shoes. He sat in the darkness of the surveillance suite, a room hidden behind a seamless mahogany panel in his vast library. The only light came from a wall of ultra-high-definition monitors, casting a ghostly blue glow over his features. The light caught the sharp lines of the tattoos on his neck, a series of interlocking geometric patterns that disappeared beneath the collar of his silk shirt, marking him as a man who had survived a life of calculated violence. His hands, also heavily inked with the imagery of traditional Korean tigers and scales of justice, rested perfectly still on the console. Zakai was a man of immense, suffocating wealth, but as he stared at screen 4, he felt like a beggar. On that screen was Aloan. His 7-year-old daughter looked like a porcelain doll left out in the rain. Her skin was a translucent gray, and the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen concentrator beside her bed was a constant reminder of Zakai's greatest failure. He could move markets, he could silence enemies with a phone call, but he could not command his daughter's lungs to take in the air. At exactly 3:00 a.m., the heavy oak door to Aloan's suite groaned open. Zakai leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. Ifananya entered. She was a woman of deliberate movements, her presence in the house usually so quiet that the security guards often forgot she was there. She wore the simple charcoal gray uniform of the household staff, but on the high-resolution monitor, Zakai could see the way she carried herself, spine straight, chin level, not like a servant, but like someone walking through a laboratory. He watched her move to the bedside. Most of the nurses he'd hired would immediately check the digital readouts on the medical monitors, but Ifananya didn't look at the machines. Instead, she placed a hand, scarred at the knuckles and dark against the pale sheets, lightly on Aloan's forehead. "What are you looking for?" Zakai whispered to the empty room, his voice a gravelly rasp. He watched as Ifananya reached into a hidden pocket in her apron. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had personally vetted her, 6 months of deep background checks, scouring records from Seattle to Lagos. She was supposed to be a widow, a domestic worker with no ties to his rivals. But as she pulled a small, hand-carved wooden vial from her pocket, Zakai realized his security had missed something. The vial was ancient, the wood polished to a dark sheen by years of touch. Ifananya unscrewed the cap. A faint, silver-green vapor seemed to curl out, though it might have been a trick of the low-light camera. She didn't give it to Aloan to drink. Instead, she dipped a long, slender finger into the substance and began to trace patterns on the soles of the sleeping girl's feet. Zakai's grip tightened on his glass of scotch until his knuckles turned white, matching the scars on Ifananya's hands. "Who are you?" he thought. He remembered her interview. She had spoken in a soft, melodic tone, her English perfect but flavored with the lilt of her homeland. She had claimed she wanted the job because she understood the silence of a house with a sick child. On the screen, Ifananya began to hum. It wasn't a melody Zakai recognized. It was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to trigger the audio sensors on the camera, causing the decibel meter to flicker in a rhythmic pattern. It wasn't a lullaby. It sounded like a frequency, a deliberate calibration of sound meant to harmonize with the mechanical hiss of the oxygen machine. Aloan, who usually spent her nights thrashing in the grip of night terrors, suddenly stilled. Her breathing, which was usually ragged and shallow, seemed to find a new, deeper tempo. Zakai watched, mesmerized and terrified. In his world, secrets were weapons. If Ifananya was hiding this medicine, she was a threat. But if she was helping, why the secrecy? Why did she look so pained as she performed these acts? He zoomed the camera in. A single tear escaped Ifananya's eye and fell onto Aloan's hand. She quickly wiped it away, her expression returning to a mask of stoic professionalism. She spent the next hour moving through the room, not cleaning but adjusting. She moved a heavy crystal vase from the dresser to the windowsill, ensuring the moonlight hit the water at a specific angle. She adjusted the vents, not to close them, but to change the direction of the airflow. "She's terraforming the room," Zakai muttered, his mind racing. He reached for his encrypted phone and dialed his head of security, Kalen. "Sir," the voice crackled on the other end. "I want a full forensic sweep of Ifananya's living quarters tomorrow when she's on her break," Zakai ordered, his eyes never leaving the screen. "And I want the liquid in that vial sampled. Don't let her see you. And Kalen, if she catches you, don't use force. Just watch her." "Is there a threat, sir?" Zakai looked at the screen. Ifananya was now sitting in the corner of the room, her eyes closed, her lips moving in what looked like a silent recitation of a complex formula. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped with the weight of a secret that seemed even heavier than Zakai's empire. "I don't know yet," Zakai replied, his voice softening as he watched Aloan's chest rise and fall with a steadiness he hadn't seen in years. "I don't know if she's the one who's going to kill me, or the only one who can save her." He stayed in the chair until the sun began to bleed through the Seattle fog, watching the woman on the screen. He was a man who owned everything, yet as the morning light hit the gold leaf on his office walls, he realized he was just a spectator in a mystery he couldn't control. The ink on his hands felt cold. The wealth in his vaults felt like lead. The morning sun did not bring clarity to the estate. It only served to highlight the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light that pierced through the floor-to-ceiling glass. Zakai had not slept. He sat in his study, his fingers tracing the sharp, black ink of the hawk on his hand, a habit he fell into whenever a problem refused to be solved by money or muscle. The wealth on display here was calculated to intimidate. The hand-woven silk rugs from Isfahan, the sculptures that cost more than most small-town hospitals. But to Zakai, it all felt like a gilded cage. He pulled up the playback from the previous night. He was obsessed with the way Ifananya moved. There was a rhythm to her service that he had dismissed as simple efficiency. But now, under the scrutiny of his high-definition lenses, it looked like a sequence. On screen 2, he watched her enter the kitchen. Even here, in the heart of the mansion's domestic staff area, she was an island. The other workers, the sous chefs, the cleaners, the laundry staff, moved around her like water around a stone. She didn't engage in the morning gossip or the complaints about the long hours. She simply took her tray and began to prepare Aloan's morning broth. But Zakai noticed something. She wasn't using the pre-measured ingredients the nutritionist had prescribed. As she stood at the industrial stove, her back turned to the other staff, Ifananya reached into her pocket. She pulled out a small, dried flower, something that looked like a withered blue star, and crushed it between her palms, letting the fine dust fall into the simmering liquid. She did it with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times, her eyes scanning the room for any wandering gazes. "Enhance," Zakai whispered to the system. The image zoomed in on the flower. It wasn't a species he recognized. It wasn't in the botanical database he had spent the last hour cross-referencing. It was something rare, something smuggled or grown in secret. "Why the broth, Ifananya?" he murmured. "Is it a cure, or is it the thing that keeps her weak?" The mystery wasn't just in what she was adding, but in how she was calculating the environment. Later that afternoon, the cameras in Aloan's room captured Ifananya performing what Zakai began to think of as the geometry. She moved a heavy mahogany chair 3 inches to the left. She adjusted the angle of a crystal vase so that the afternoon light refracted into a specific corner of the room where a humidifying plant sat. She wasn't just tidying, she was manipulating the light, the airflow, and the very energy of the space. It was too precise to be superstition. It looked like engineering. A knock at the door broke his trance. It was Kalen, his head of security, a man whose face was as scarred as Zakai's was tattooed. "Sir, we did the sweep of her quarters while she was with the child," Kalen said, dropping a tablet onto the desk. "We found nothing. No hidden vials, no communication devices, no ledgers. Her room is empty, almost unnervingly so. It's like she's living out of a suitcase she hasn't unpacked yet." Zakai frowned, his gaze returning to the monitor where Ifananya was now reading to Aloan. "What about the vial from last night, the one she used on the girl's feet?" "Vanished," Kalen replied, his voice tight with frustration. "We searched every inch of her uniform in the laundry. We checked the trash. Nothing. She's either the best ghost I've ever tracked or we're looking for the wrong things." Zakai dismissed him with a wave of his hand. He didn't want a security report. He wanted to understand the look in Ifananya's eyes when she thought no one was watching. He switched the audio to the room's sensitive microphones. Ifananya was reading a classic fairy tale, but her voice was low, and underneath the words of the story, she was weaving in something else. Between the sentences, she was whispering numbers. 7410214. Zakai's blood ran cold. Those weren't just numbers. Those were Aloan's blood gas levels from the previous week, data that was stored on a secure, encrypted medical server in the house. Data that a maid should have no access to. Suspicion flared in his chest, a hot, familiar burn. Was she a corporate spy? A rival trying to study the progression of the illness for their own gain? But then he saw it. On the screen, Aloan reached out a thin, pale hand and touched Ifananya's cheek. The maid didn't pull away. She leaned into the child's touch, and for a fleeting second, the stoic mask shattered. A look of such profound, agonizing grief crossed Ifananya's face that Zakai felt a pang of unexpected empathy. It was the look of a woman who was looking at a ghost. She wasn't there to steal secrets. She was there because she was haunted. "Who did you lose, Ifananya?" Zakai asked the screen, his voice barely a breath. "And why do you think my daughter is the way to bring them back?" He watched as Ifananya stood up and walked toward the hidden camera lens. She stopped just inches away. For a moment, Zakai thought she was going to disable it. Instead, she reached out and adjusted the angle of the vent right next to the camera, redirecting the flow of oxygen toward Aloan's bed. As she did, the sleeve of her uniform pulled back, revealing a faint, faded scar on her forearm. A series of numbers branded into the skin, followed by a medical symbol he didn't recognize. It wasn't a tattoo, it was a mark of ownership. Zakai sat back, the leather of his chair creaking. The mystery had shifted. He wasn't watching a maid. He was watching a fugitive. And if she was a fugitive, the people she was running from were likely far more dangerous than the Mafia Zakai supposedly led. He realized then that the cameras were no longer a tool for protection. They were a window into a war he didn't know was being fought in his own home. He had spent his life watching for the enemy at the gate. never realizing that the savior, or the executioner, was already inside, tucking his daughter into bed with a prayer made of chemistry and a heart made of ash. The rain in Seattle was a relentless gray veil that blurred the line between the sky and the dark waters of the Sound. Inside the estate, the climate was a stagnant, expensive warmth, but Zakai felt a chill that no furnace could touch. He was back in the surveillance suite, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off the expensive crystal of his Scotch glass. He had spent the last 6 hours reviewing the footage of Chapter 2, over and over, obsessed with the brand on Ifananya's arm and the way she whispered those medical vitals. He picked up the phone. He didn't call his usual security team. He called a man named Vane, a data ghost who specialized in erasing and finding people who didn't exist on the standard grid. "I need a deep dive," Zakai said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous register that made most men tremble. "Ifananya. No last name provided, but check for researchers, doctors, or political exiles from the Lagos-Seattle medical corridor. Look for a brand, a series of numbers followed by a stylized caduceus with a broken wing." "That sounds like a high-level pharmaceutical mark, Zakai," Vane's voice crackled, sounding like sandpaper on stone. "You sure you want to pull that thread? Those people have more lawyers than you have soldiers." "I don't care about their lawyers," Zakai hissed, his eyes fixed on screen 4. "I care about what she's putting in my daughter's lungs." On the screen, the room was bathed in the soft, amber glow of a single nightlight. Ifananya was sitting in the corner, her posture rigid. She wasn't sleeping. She was staring at Aloan with an intensity that looked like she was trying to keep the girl alive through sheer force of will. Zakai watched as Ifananya stood up and walked to the window. She pressed her hand against the glass, looking out into the rain. The camera captured the reflection of her face, not the face of a maid, but of a woman who was mourning a world she could never return to. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver locket. She didn't open it. She just held it against her heart, her lips moving in a silent, desperate prayer. Zakai zoomed in. The locket was engraved with a name in a language he couldn't read, but the craftsmanship was exquisite. This wasn't the jewelry of a woman who worked for minimum wage. "Who were you before you came here to hide in my shadows?" Zakai whispered. Suddenly, the monitor flickered. A shadow moved across the hallway outside Aloan's room. It wasn't one of Zakai's guards. He knew the gait of every man he employed. This person was lighter, faster, moving with a predatory silence. Zakai's hand flew to the alarm, but he paused. On the screen, Ifananya had also noticed. She didn't scream. She didn't call for help. Instead, she moved with lightning speed, positioned herself between the door and Aloan's bed, and reached into the underside of the mahogany nightstand. She pulled out a syringe, not a medical one, but a heavy-duty industrial injector. She held it like a weapon. The door handle turned slowly. Zakai's heart thudded against his ribs. The intruder cracked the door open, the light from the hallway casting a long, thin spear across the rug. But before the intruder could step inside, Ifananya spoke. It was a single word, sharp and guttural, in a dialect Zakai had never heard. The intruder froze. There was a tense, agonizing silence. Then, slowly, the door closed. The shadow retreated. Zakai stared at the screen, his breath hitching. Ifananya didn't relax. She stayed in that defensive crouch for 20 minutes, the syringe held ready, her eyes fixed on the door. She looked like a lioness guarding a cub that wasn't hers. She's not just hiding here, Zakai realized, the ink on his neck feeling hot as his pulse spiked. She's using my house as a fortress, and the enemy just found the gate. He spent the rest of the night watching the replay of those few seconds. The way the intruder had stopped at the sound of her voice suggested recognition. A shared past, a shared fear. Zakai felt a strange, twisting emotion in his chest. For years, he had been the one people feared. He was the boss. He was the man with the tattoos and the power. But in this moment, watching this woman stand guard over his dying daughter, he felt like a child. He realized that the wealth surrounding him was just paper and glass. It couldn't stop the shadows that were coming for Ifananya, and by extension, for Aloan. He looked at his own hands, the symbols of his life's work etched into his skin. He had always believed that power was about taking. But as he watched Ifananya finally sit back down, her hand trembling as she tucked the syringe back into its hiding place, he started to wonder if power was actually about what you were willing to lose. "Vane," Zakai said, clicking the comms back on. "Forget the pharmaceutical records. Search the international disappeared lists for a woman named Ifananya, and look for the name Zakai in her history. I want to know if she chose this house, or if she chose me." The screen stayed on her face, a mask of cold, quiet determination. The mystery was no longer about a maid with a secret. It was about a father who realized he was no longer the most dangerous person in the room. The rain outside the Seattle estate had turned into a rhythmic drumming, a percussive backdrop to the silence that gripped the mansion's interior. Zakai sat in the surveillance suite, his eyes bloodshot, the glow of the monitors casting long, distorted shadows across the mahogany walls. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. His mind was a frantic loom, weaving together the brand on Ifananya's arm, the industrial syringe she handled like a soldier, and the way the intruder had retreated at the mere sound of her voice. He looked down at his own hands. The ink, the heavy, dark lines of the hawk on his right hand, felt like a weight. In the underground, that hawk represented a man who saw everything and missed nothing. But here, in the safety of his own home, he felt blind. On the center monitor, screen 4, a miracle was beginning to unfold, though it looked more like a crisis. Eloin was thrashing. Her fever, which had been a low, persistent simmer for weeks, had suddenly spiked. The medical monitors, the official ones Zakai had paid millions for, began to wail. Their shrill, electronic screams echoed through the surveillance speakers, a jagged sound that tore through the room's expensive stillness. Zakai reached for the intercom to call the on-site doctors, his thumb hovering over the red button. But then, he saw Ifananya. She didn't look panicked, she looked ready. She didn't call for the medical team. Instead, she moved to the door and turned the deadbolt, a heavy thud that resonated through the audio feed. She was locking them out. "What are you doing?" Zakai whispered, his voice cracking. "Ifananya, open that door." He watched as she ignored the sirens of the machines. She moved to the bedside and began to strip the blankets off Eloin's shivering frame. The girl was gasping, her chest heaving in that terrifying, shallow way that usually preceded a total respiratory collapse. Ifananya reached into the ventilation shaft, the same one where Zakai had hidden the primary 4K camera. For a moment, her face filled the screen, her dark eyes looking directly into the lens. There was no fear in them, only a cold, clinical focus. She pulled out a small leather pouch that had been taped to the interior of the duct. From the pouch, she extracted a series of vials and a small, ceramic bowl. She began to mix a paste, her movements blurred by speed. She was adding the blue star dust from the kitchen, a thick, amber oil, and a handful of crushed white petals that looked like bone. Outside the bedroom door, the medical team had arrived. Zakai could hear their frantic knocking and the muffled shouts of the lead physician. "Open the door. The girl's vitals are dropping. We need to intubate." Ifananya didn't even flinch. She took the paste and began to apply it to Eloin's chest and throat, tracing the same geometric patterns Zakai had seen her draw on the girl's feet. As she did, she began to recite something, not a prayer, but a sequence of chemical ratios. Hydrogen-oxygen bridge, 4.2, catalytic salt, hold the breath, hold the light. Zakai's hand stayed on the intercom button, but he didn't press it. He was a man who lived by instinct, and his instinct told him that if he opened that door, the medical team would interrupt something they didn't understand. He was watching a woman fight a war with ghosts, using weapons made of plants and poetry. On the screen, Eloin's face turned a deep, terrifying shade of purple. The heart rate monitor flatlined into a continuous, high-pitched tone. "Sir, we're breaking the door down." Kalen's voice came through the security channel. "Wait," Zakai roared into the mic, his voice shaking the walls of the study. "Nobody touches that door until I say so." "But sir, the girl, she's flatlining." "I said wait." Zakai watched the screen, his heart stopping in his chest. Ifananya leaned over Aloan. She pressed her mouth to the girl, not to give her air, but to whisper. She blew a single, sharp breath into Aloan's lungs, a breath that seemed to carry the scent of the crushed herbs. For 5 seconds, there was nothing. No sound but the flat line of the machine. Then Aloan gasped. It wasn't the shallow, desperate gasp of a dying child. It was a deep, resonant intake of air, the kind of breath a person takes after being underwater for too long. The heart rate monitor began to beep again, slow and steady. The purple hue drained from her face, replaced by a soft, healthy flush of pink. Ifananya collapsed into the chair by the bed, her face buried in her hands. She was shaking, her shoulders heaving with a silent, exhausted sob. Zakai slumped back into his own chair, the adrenaline leaving him in a cold rush. He watched as Aloan reached out in her sleep and grabbed Ifananya's sleeve. The girl was breathing, truly breathing. For the first time in a year, the rattling sound in her chest was gone. He looked at the monitor where Ifananya was now slowly cleaning up the ceramic bowl and the leather pouch. She moved with the heaviness of someone who had just spent 10 years of her life in 10 minutes. The mystery wasn't just about what she had done. It was about why she was doing it in secret. If she had this cure, this ghost medicine, why was she working as a maid for a man like him? Why wasn't she in a lab? Why wasn't she famous? The brand on her arm flashed in the light as she reached for a towel. The broken wing caduceus. Zakai picked up his phone. Vane's number was already on the screen. I found it, Zakai, the data ghost said, his voice sounding hollow. I found the name associated with that brand. It's not a pharmaceutical company. It's a black site research facility in the Niger Delta, funded by a conglomerate called Ethelgard. They were working on atmospheric respiratory recovery, trying to find a way to make humans survive in polluted zones. And Ifananya? Zakai asked. She wasn't a maid, Zakai. She was the chief of research, Dr. Ifananya Okoro. She disappeared 3 years ago after the facility was cleansed following a massive data leak. They said she died in the fire. But if she's in your house, then she's a walking billion-dollar asset, and Ethelgard doesn't like to lose their property. Zakai looked at the screen. Ifananya was tucking Aloan in, her touch so tender it hurt to watch. He looked at his own tattoos, the marks of a man who had built a kingdom on shadow and bone. He realized then that he hadn't just hired a caregiver. He had invited a war into his home. But as he watched Aloan's chest rise and fall in a perfect, healthy rhythm, he knew he didn't care. He would burn his empire to the ground to keep that rhythm going. Vane, Zakai said, his voice turning to ice. Scrub the Seattle grid. I want every camera within 10 miles of this estate looped. If anyone from Ethelgard even breathes in this zip code, I want to know before they do. You're going to war for a maid, boss. Zakai looked at the screen, at the black woman who had just breathed life back into his daughter, and the white marble room that felt more like a tomb. No, Zakai replied. I'm going to war for the woman who saved my soul. And tell the medical team to go home. They're fired. He leaned in, his tattooed hand touching the screen over Ifananya's face. The secret was out. The fever had broken. But the real fever, the one that would draw the world's most dangerous men to his doorstep, was just beginning to rise. The aftermath of the miracle left the estate in a state of vibrating tension. Zakai sat in his study, the room smelling of old paper and the sharp, metallic tang of the rain still clinging to the windows. The medical team had been dismissed, escorted off the premises by Kalen's men with NDAs that cost more than their medical degrees. The house was quiet, but it was the silence of a held breath. Zakai's eyes were fixed on screen 4. Aloan was sleeping, actually sleeping, without the wheezing mechanical aid of the oxygen concentrator. It sat in the corner, a redundant sentinel of a past life. Ifananya was gone from the room, currently on her scheduled 4-hour rest period. Zakai knew she wouldn't be resting. He watched the camera in the staff hallway. She moved toward her quarters, her gait heavy, her hand trailing along the wainscoting as if she were using the wall to keep herself upright. Kalen, Zakai whispered into his earpiece. She left something in the room, under the floorboard near the humidifier. I saw her shadow linger there for 3 seconds too long when she was cleaning the spill. Get it for me. Sir, you said not to let her see us. She's in the shower. You have 6 minutes, go. Zakai watched the feed as Kalen entered Aloan's room with the silence of a ghost. He watched the man pry up a loose piece of the parquet flooring. From the dark cavity beneath, Kalen pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. It was battered, the edges charred as if it had been rescued from a fire. Minutes later, the journal sat on Zakai's desk. He didn't open it immediately. He looked at his own tattooed hands, then at the scorched leather. This was her soul. This was the why behind the what. When he finally opened it, he didn't find a diary. He found a masterpiece of hidden science. The pages were a chaotic, beautiful mess of botanical sketches, chemical equations, and what looked like musical notations. There were drawings of the blue star flower he had seen her use, labeled in a script that shifted between English, Igbo, and a complex mathematical code. As he turned the pages, the tone of the journal shifted. The neat, clinical diagrams began to be interrupted by frantic, handwritten notes in the margins. The atmospheric density is too high in Seattle, one note read. The particulate matter from the port is aggravating the alveolar collapse. I must adjust the salt ratio. If they find me, they will take the girl. Not to save her, but to harvest the results. I cannot let Aloan become a data point, not like Zakai's wife. Zakai's heart stopped. The book slipped from his fingers, hitting the desk with a heavy thud. Not like Zakai's wife. He stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. His wife, Mina, had died of a rare respiratory failure 4 years ago. It was the same illness Aloan had. He had always believed it was a genetic fluke, a cruel hand dealt by fate. But the way Ifananya wrote it sounded like an observation, like a known variable. He flipped through the back of the book. There, tucked into the binding, was a photograph. It was a younger Ifananya, dressed in a white lab coat, standing in front of a glass-walled facility that looked like something out of a science fiction film. Next to her was a woman who made Zakai's blood turn to ice. It was Mina. They were smiling. They were holding a prototype of a portable filtration device. The caption at the bottom, written in Mina's elegant, looped handwriting, read, "For the future of the children, Lagos-Seattle Bridge Project, Year 1. Zakai felt the world tilting. His wealth, his Mafia connections, his iron-fisted control over the city, it was all a joke. He had been playing a game of checkers while the people who killed his wife were playing a game of gods. He looked back at the monitor. Ifananya was out of the shower now. She was standing in the middle of her small, Spartan room, her wet hair clinging to her neck. She looked at the floor, then at the vent where the camera was hidden. She didn't look angry that he had taken the book. She looked relieved. She walked toward the camera until her face filled the screen. She didn't speak, but she held up her hand, revealing the brand on her arm. She traced the numbers with her thumb, then pointed toward the west wing where Aloan slept. "They are coming, Zakai," she mouthed. She didn't use a voice, but the shape of her lips was unmistakable. "And they aren't coming for me. They're coming for the only successful prototype left." Zakai realized with a sickening jolt that Aloan wasn't just his daughter anymore. To the people Ifananya fled from, Aloan was the cure. She was the walking, breathing evidence of a billion-dollar breakthrough that had been buried in blood and fire. He sat back down, his tattooed fingers trembling. He had spent months watching Ifananya, waiting for her to betray him. He had planted cameras to catch a killer. Instead, he had caught a woman who was the only shield standing between his daughter and the people who had already taken his wife. The mystery wasn't, what is the maid doing? The mystery was, how do I stop being a boss and start being a father before the people who branded her come to brand us all? Zakai picked up the journal and tucked it into his jacket, right against his heart. He looked at the ink on his hand, the hawk. For the first time, he understood what the hawk was for. It wasn't for hunting. It was for watching the horizon so the nest stayed safe. "Kalen," Zakai said, his voice now a low, terrifying hum of redirected purpose. Get the heavy armor out of storage, seal the perimeter, and tell Ifananya. Tell her she doesn't have to hide in the vents anymore. Tell her she has a seat at my table. Sir, you're inviting the maid to the war room. She isn't a maid, Kaylin, Zakai said, his eyes fixed on the woman on the screen who was now nodding as if she had heard him. She's the only one in this house who knows how to win. The silence of the Seattle estate had changed. It was no longer the heavy, stagnant quiet of a tomb, but the electric, vibrating hush of a command center before a strike. Zakai stood at the head of the long, obsidian dining table, his tattooed hands planted firmly on the surface. The room was illuminated by the soft glow of architectural lighting, casting long shadows against the walls of fine art and high-security monitors. Across from him sat Ifananya. She was no longer wearing the charcoal-gray maid's uniform. She wore a simple, dark sweater, her posture no longer bowed by the performance of servitude. On the table between them lay the scorched journal and the photograph of Mina. Zakai's eyes stayed on the photo. Seeing his late wife's smile, the genuine, radiant warmth she only showed when she thought she was changing the world, felt like a physical blow to his chest. You knew her, Zakai said, his voice a jagged rasp. All those months I watched you on the cameras. You were looking at her face in Alohan's. You weren't just treating a patient. You were finishing a job. Ifananya didn't flinch. She looked at the tattoos on Zakai's neck, then up at his eyes. Mina wasn't just a benefactor, Zakai. She was the one who realized that Ethelgard was using the project to create a monopoly on survival. They weren't just looking for a cure for the sick. They were looking for a way to make the very air we breathe a subscription service. She reached out and tapped the photograph. Mina found the data leak. She realized the respiratory failure cases appearing in the Delta and in certain zip codes in the U.S. weren't accidents. They were trials. Your wife didn't die of a rare disease, Zakai. She died because she tried to walk away with the antidote. Zakai felt a cold, familiar rage beginning to coil in his gut, but he pushed it down. He couldn't afford the luxury of anger, not yet. And Alohan, why is she sick? Because the exposure didn't end with Mina, Ifananya said softly. The agents are persistent. They stay in the blood. They stay in the home. Alohan was the secondary target, a way to keep you neutralized, kept busy with grief and medical bills so you wouldn't look too closely at the business interests Mina left behind. Zakai looked at the monitors. On screen 4, Alohan was sitting up in bed, looking at a picture book. Her breathing was silent, effortless. But you cured her. You used the blue star and the frequencies. Why? I didn't just cure her, Ifananya corrected him, her voice gaining a sharp, academic edge. I stabilized the cellular bridge, but Alohan isn't just a child anymore. To the people who branded me, she is the only living proof that the Ethelgard protocol can be reversed. She is a walking, breathing threat to a trillion-dollar industry. That is why I had to stay in the shadows. If I had come to you as a doctor, they would have killed us both before I could mix the first dose. Zakai walked to the window, looking out at the rainy Seattle skyline. His empire suddenly felt small. He was a man who moved tons of cargo, who influenced elections, who held the keys to the city's underworld. But he was fighting an enemy that used the very air as a weapon. You said they are coming, Zakai said, turning back to her. How long? They've been here for weeks, Ifananya replied, her eyes narrowing. The intruder you saw on the camera, that wasn't an assassin, that was a gatherer. They check the vitals remotely. They know Alohan's fever broke. They know the miracle happened. In their world, miracles are stolen property. The tension in the room was interrupted by a low chime from the security console. Kaylin's face appeared on the secondary screen. Sir, we have a situation at the north perimeter. No breach, but the sensors are picking up a localized EMP pulse. It fried the exterior cameras for exactly 3 seconds. It's a signature I've never seen. Zakai looked at Ifananya. She stood up, her face pale but her hands steady. The geometry I was doing in the room, she said. The furniture, the plants, the vases. It wasn't just for Alohan's health. It was to create a dead zone for their scanners. But now that she's breathing on her own, the biosignature is too loud to hide. Zakai felt the shift. The mystery was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a siege. He reached into the drawer of the obsidian table and pulled out a heavy, black handgun, laying it on the table. Next to it, he placed the leather-bound journal. "I spent my whole life being the wolf at the door," Zakai said, the ink on his hand pulsing as he gripped the weapon. "But they've forgotten one thing about men like me. I don't care about the industry. I don't care about the future of the children. I care about my child." He looked Ifananya in the eye. For the first time, the boss and the maid were gone. There were only two parents, standing in a fortress made of glass, waiting for the wolves. "Ifananya," Zakai said, his voice a low, terrifying promise. "Go to Aloan, stay in the dead zone. Kaylin and I will handle the visitors." "Zakai," she called out as he turned to leave. "They don't use bullets, they use the air. If the vents start to smell like ozone, don't breathe." Zakai nodded, a dark, tattooed ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I've been holding my breath for 4 years, Doctor. I think I can manage a few more minutes." As he stepped out into the hallway, the lights in the estate flickered and dimmed. The high-tech surveillance screens he had used to spy on Ifananya suddenly went to static. The watchman was now blind, and the predators were inside the fence. The mystery had reached its boiling point. It was no longer about what happened in the dark, it was about who would survive the light. The mansion was no longer a home, it had become a pressurized chamber. Following Ifananya's warning, Zakai had ordered a total lockdown of the HVAC system. The silence that followed was unnatural, a heavy, tomb-like quiet that made every creak of the floorboards sound like a gunshot. Zakai stood in the center of the command hub, his eyes fixed on the few monitors that hadn't been scrambled by the localized EMP. The tattoos on his neck felt tight, a physical manifestation of the adrenaline surging through his veins. He looked at the secondary screen, which showed a thermal map of the estate's perimeter. There were no heat signatures, no bodies moving through the trees, but the sensors were screaming. "They aren't using people, Kaylin," Zakai whispered into his comms, his voice echoing in the empty hall. "They're using drones, micro-drones. Watch the atmospheric pressure sensors." On the table before him, the digital readout for the estate's air quality began to fluctuate. A fine, bluish mist was beginning to settle against the exterior of the glass walls, a substance that looked like frost but moved like a living thing. Inside the West Wing, Ifananya was moving with the frantic, focused energy of a woman who had seen this before. She wasn't hiding, she was fortifying. She had moved Aloan into the center of the room, far from the vents and the windows. She was using a roll of heavy, medical-grade adhesive to seal the seams of the door. "Zakai, can you hear me?" Ifananya's voice came through the encrypted internal line. It was steady, but there was an edge of desperation to it. "The mist outside. It's a synthetic neuroinhibitor. It doesn't need a vent to get in. It targets the microscopic fissures in the window seals. You need to activate the positive pressure override in the library. Now." Zakai didn't hesitate. He began to move through the house, his heavy boots muffled by the thick rugs. He moved with the grace of a predator, his hand never straying far from the weapon at his hip. As he reached the library, he saw it, a faint, shimmering haze beginning to bleed through the corner of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He lunged for the manual override lever hidden behind a row of first edition books. With a grunt of effort, he slammed the lever down. A deep, mechanical thrum groaned from the depths of the basement. The house's air system reversed, pushing air out of every crack and crevice, creating a protective bubble of pressure that blew the bluish mist away from the glass. Zakai slumped against the wall, his chest heaving. He looked at the window. The mist was swirling angrily, unable to penetrate the barrier. "It's holding," he panted. "Ifananya, the pressure is stabilized, but we're trapped. I can't send my men out into that air, and we can't stay in here forever." "We don't need to stay in here forever," Ifananya replied. "We only need to stay in here until the sun hits the mist. It's UV sensitive. It's designed for nightops, but Zakai, that was just the first wave. They were testing the seals. Now they know where the pressure is coming from." Zakai looked at the monitors. The thermal map was finally picking something up. 3 vehicles, black, unmarked and moving with eerie silence, were coming up the private drive. They weren't stopping at the gate. They were driving right through it. "Kalen, engage the kinetic barriers," Zakai ordered, his voice turning to stone. "If they want to play a game of science, let's remind them that this is a house of war." But as he watched the lead vehicle, he realized this wasn't a standard hit squad. The men stepping out weren't wearing tactical gear. They were wearing hazmat suits with the Ethilgard logo emblazoned on the chest. They didn't carry rifles, they carried long, pressurized canisters. Zakai felt a surge of protective fury that nearly blinded him. These were the people who had branded Ifananya. These were the people who had turned his wife's brilliance into a cage and his daughter's life into a laboratory. He looked at the camera in Aloin's room. Ifananya was sitting on the floor, holding Aloin's hand. The girl was awake, her eyes wide, but her breathing remained steady. Ifananya was whispering to her, her lips moving in what looked like a song. "She's brave," Zakai murmured, a strange, painful warmth blossoming in his chest. He had spent years surrounding himself with tough men, soldiers, enforcers, killers. But none of them had the courage of this woman, who was facing her greatest nightmare with nothing but a ceramic bowl and a steady hand. He stood up, adjusting the silk sleeves of his shirt to cover the hawk on his hand. He wasn't going to hide in the surveillance suite anymore. He was going to the foyer. "Kalen, bring the men to the inner perimeter," Zakai said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "But tell them to keep their masks on. We aren't just defending a house, we're defending a miracle." He began to walk toward the main entrance, his shadow long and jagged against the marble floor. Every step was a declaration. The mystery of who Ifananya was had been solved. The mystery of why she was here had been answered. Now, there was only one question left. What happens when the man who owns the shadows meets the people who own the light? As he reached the heavy, reinforced doors of the foyer, he saw the lead Ethilgard agent step onto the porch. The man tapped on the glass with a gloved finger, holding up a digital tablet. On the screen was a warrant, not from the police, but from a private international health tribunal. It claimed that the subject inside the house was a biohazard risk and must be reclaimed for public safety. Zakai didn't open the door. He didn't even acknowledge the tablet. He simply raised his hand, the one with the hawk, and pressed it against the glass. He stared into the darkened visor of the agent's helmet, his eyes promising a level of violence that no legal document could prevent. "You're on the wrong property," Zakai's voice boomed through the exterior speakers, shaking the very glass the agent stood behind. "And you're looking for a doctor who doesn't work for you anymore. She works for the family, and in this house, family is the only law." The agent hesitated. Behind him, the other men began to prime their canisters. The siege was about to move from the air to the earth. Inside the West Wing, Ifananya heard Zakai's voice through the speakers. She closed her eyes, a single tear of relief sliding down her cheek. She had spent 3 years running, waiting for someone to stop her and tell her she was safe. She never thought the person to say it would be a man whose hands were covered in ink and blood. The air inside the estate had become an enemy. Even with the positive pressure system humming like a trapped beast in the basement, the atmosphere felt thin, ionized, and metallic. Zakai stood in the foyer, the heavy reinforced glass of the front doors vibrating under the rhythmic thuds of the Ethilgard extraction team. He watched through the monitors as the men in white suits deployed atmospheric scrubbers, devices designed to neutralize the pressure bubble he had created. The tattoos on Zakai's neck seemed to itch, a phantom sensation brought on by the encroaching chemical haze. He looked at his hand, the hawk's wings spread across his knuckles, and felt a profound sense of irony. He had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, only to find that the world could simply turn the oxygen against him. "Kalen," Zakai said, his voice a low vibration in the comms. "They're trying to starve the air. How much time do we have before the filters saturate?" "At this rate, 40 minutes, sir." Kalen's voice was strained, the sound of a man who was used to fighting people, not molecules. "After that, the pressure drops and that blue mist will start coming through the electrical conduits." Zakai turned away from the door. He didn't move toward the weapons locker. He moved toward the West Wing. He needed to see the woman who had turned his home into a sanctuary and a target. Inside Alohan's suite, the scene was one of quiet, clinical desperation. Ifananya was no longer sitting. She was on her knees in front of her makeshift laboratory, a collection of crystal bowls and silver spoons she had scavenged from the kitchen. The room was filled with the heavy, sweet scent of crushed lavender and something sharper, something like ozone. She was frantic. Her hands, usually so steady they could trace a line on a child's foot without a tremor, were shaking. She was scraping the bottom of the wooden vial, the one Zakai had seen on the very first night through his hidden cameras. "It's not enough," she whispered, her voice a ragged thread. "The humidity is dropping. The catalyst needs moisture to bond with the particles." Zakai entered the room, the door clicking shut behind him. He didn't look at the monitors or the impending breach. He looked at Ifananya. She looked smaller than she had a week ago, her eyes sunken from lack of sleep, her skin gray under the harsh fluorescent lights she had insisted on installing to mimic the UV spectrum. "What do you need, Ifananya?" Zakai asked. His voice was no longer that of a boss or a warden. It was the voice of a man who was ready to offer anything. She looked up at him, and for the first time, Zakai saw the full depth of her grief. "I've used everything, Zakai. The blue star is gone. The salts are depleted. To keep the air in this room clean enough for Alohan to survive the next hour, I need a biological stabilizer. Something to bind the toxins before they reach her lungs." She looked at her own arm, at the brand that marked her as property. "My blood is already saturated with the prototype. It's why I survived the fire in Lagos. It's why I can breathe when the air turns to glass." Zakai's heart tightened. He realized what she was suggesting. She wasn't just a doctor, she was the cure. Her very biology had been rewritten by the research she had stolen. "No," Zakai said, stepping toward her. "I won't let you bleed for this house, not anymore." "It's not for the house," she snapped, her voice cracking with a sudden, violent emotion. "It's for the only thing that matters. Do you think I came here for your money? Do you think I care about this glass palace? I came here because Alohan is the only one left who carries Mina's hope. If she dies, the research dies with her, and Ethelgard wins. They get to decide who breathes and who suffocates." She stood up, her eyes flashing. "You spent months watching me on those cameras, Zakai. You watched me mix the teas, you watched me move the furniture, you watched me pray. Did you ever once see me look for an exit? Did you ever once see me reach for your safe or your secrets?" Zakai remained silent. The weight of his own suspicion felt like lead in his stomach. He remembered the hours he had spent in the dark, his tattooed fingers drumming on the desk, waiting for her to slip up. He had looked for a traitor and found a martyr. "I saw a woman who was carrying a world on her shoulders," Zakai said softly, "and I was too arrogant to offer to help carry it." Outside, a deafening explosion rocked the estate. The monitors in the room flickered and died. The hum of the pressure system changed, a high-pitched whine that signaled a mechanical failure. The scrubbers had won. The pressure was dropping. A thin, wispy trail of the blue mist began to curl through the ceiling vent. Ifananya didn't hesitate. She grabbed a sterile lancet from her kit. "Zakai, listen to me. I need you to hold her. Don't let her inhale until I tell you. I'm going to use the humidifier to aerosolize the stabilizer. It will create a localized field." "Ifananya." "Do it," she screamed over the sound of the failing machinery. Zakai lunged for Alohan, pulling the sleeping girl into his arms. He pressed her face against the ink of his chest, shielding her with his body. He watched as Ifananya made a shallow cut across her palm. She didn't flinch. She held her hand over the bowl of the humidifier, letting the dark, copper-scented liquid fall into the water. As the blood hit the vibrating plate of the nebulizer, the mist in the room changed. The blue haze was met with a fine, golden-tinged vapor. Where the two met, the blue mist seemed to crystallize and fall to the floor as harmless dust. Ifananya slumped against the dresser, her face turning a ghostly shade of white. She was breathing in deep, jagged gasps, her own body reacting to the concentrated toxins she was neutralizing. Zakai watched her, his soul tearing in two. He was a man of action, a man of violence, and he was forced to stand still and watch a woman sacrifice her life force to save his child. He realized then that the cameras had never seen the most important thing. They could see the what, but they could never capture the why. The mystery was finally fully stripped bare. It wasn't about a maid. It wasn't about a mafia boss. It was about the terrifying, beautiful cost of being a guardian. The vents, Ifananya whispered, her eyes fluttering. Zakai, the vents are clear, but they're at the door. Zakai felt the shift in the air. The chemical threat had been neutralized for the moment, but the physical threat was now inches away. He laid Aloan back on the bed and stood up. He looked at Ifananya, then at the heavy, reinforced door that was beginning to buckle under a hydraulic ram. He didn't reach for his gun this time. He reached for his phone. Vane, Zakai said, his voice a calm, lethal whisper. Release the data, all of it. The Lagos files, the Seattle project, the Ethilgard signatures. Send it to every major news outlet, every government server, and every rival conglomerate on the planet. If they want this house so badly, let's give them the spotlight. Boss, if I do that, Ethilgard will go under, but so will your offshore interests. It'll trigger a federal audit of everything you own. Zakai looked at Ifananya, who was barely conscious, and at Aloan, who was breathing the clean, golden air. Burn it all, Zakai said, a dark, tattooed smile finally reaching his eyes. I'm tired of owning things. I'd rather own my soul. The door to the suite exploded inward. Zakai stepped into the path of the light, the hawk on his hand clenched into a fist. The mystery was over. The war had arrived, and for the first time in his life, Zakai knew exactly what he was fighting for. The world inside the West Wing dissolved into a cacophony of white light and pressurized air. When the bedroom door buckled under the hydraulic ram, it didn't just break, it disintegrated, sending shards of heavy mahogany flying like shrapnel across the room. Zakai stood his ground, his silhouette framed by the amber glow of the emergency lights, a stark contrast to the sterile, blinding LEDs of the Ethilgard extraction team. The men who entered were ghosts in white. Their hazmat suits were high-tech exoskeletons, designed to filter out the very poisons they were currently pumping into the house. They didn't carry traditional firearms. They held capture hooks and high-frequency emitters designed to scramble the nervous system. Zakai didn't wait for them to speak. He moved with a speed that defied his size, a lifetime of street-level combat distilled into a single, fluid motion. He grabbed the heavy, marble-topped nightstand and hurled it toward the lead agent. The impact was a sickening crunch of metal and stone. Kalen's now, Zakai roared. From the shadows of the walk-in closet, Kalen and two of Zakai's most trusted enforcers emerged. They weren't wearing hazmat suits. They were wearing old-school gas masks and heavy tactical vests. They didn't have the technology of Ethilgard, but they had the desperation of men who knew there was nowhere left to run. The room became a blur of violence. Zakai moved through the agents like a force of nature, his tattooed hands finding the weak points in their joints and the seals of their helmets. He wasn't just fighting for his life. He was fighting for the 10 feet of space behind him where Aloan and Ifananya lay. One of the agents raised a frequency emitter, aiming it at Ifananya. Zakai saw the device begin to glow with a malevolent violet light. He knew that one pulse would shut down her already weakened heart. He didn't think. He lunged, placing his own body in the path of the beam. The sensation was like having his blood turn to molten lead. The high-frequency waves bypassed his skin and struck directly at his nerves. His vision fractured into 1,000 shards of blue and red. The tattoos on his neck felt like they were being seared off with a hot iron. He fell to one knee, his muscles seizing, but he didn't let go of the agent's ankle. With a guttural snarl of pure, unadulterated rage, Zakai twisted, snapping the agent's leg and sending the emitter skittering across the floor. Ifananya, Zakai gasped, the air in his lungs feeling like it was filled with needles. Get her! To the sub-basement, the lead-lined vault. Ifananya, her palm still bleeding from the sacrifice she had made to stabilize the air, crawled toward Aloan. She saw the state Zakai was in, The way his body was vibrating from the electrical shock, the way his eyes were hemorrhaging. She knew he was dying to buy them seconds. "I won't leave you," she whispered, her voice a low, fierce vibration. "Go," Zakai screamed, his voice breaking. As Ifananya scooped Aloan into her arms, the girl finally opened her eyes. She didn't cry. She looked at her father, then at the man in the white suit who was struggling to get back up. In that moment, Aloan did something that silenced the room. She took a deep breath, the breath Ifananya had cultivated with her chemistry, and she spoke. It wasn't a word, it was a frequency, a high melodic hum that resonated with the very air in the room. The Ethel Guard agents froze. Their helmets began to crack. The sophisticated sensors in their suits, designed to detect the subject, biosignature, were suddenly overwhelmed. The biosignature wasn't just a reading on a screen anymore, it was a physical force. The glass vases in the room shattered simultaneously. The monitors on the wall exploded into static. Aloan wasn't just cured, she had been changed. The atmospheric respiratory recovery protocol hadn't just saved her lungs, it had turned her into a transmitter. The agents retreated, their equipment malfunctioning, their communication lines filled with the sound of a child's song. In the confusion, Kaylin grabbed Zakai's shoulder, hauling him toward the service elevator. "Boss, we have to move. Vane just sent the signal, the world is watching." As the elevator doors hissed shut, Zakai looked back into the room. He saw the lead Ethel Guard agent, his visor cracked, staring in horror at the 7-year-old girl who had just dismantled $1 billion of technology with a single breath. The mystery of the miracle had taken its final, terrifying form. Ifananya hadn't just saved Aloan, she had evolved her. And as the elevator descended into the dark, Zakai realized that the war wasn't ending. It was just changing shape. He looked at Ifananya, who was holding Aloan with a mixture of awe and terror. "What is she?" Zakai whispered, his voice barely a breath. Ifananya looked at the hawk on his hand, then at the girl in her arms. "She's the reason they killed Mina. She's the one who can breathe in the world they're building. She's the future, Zakai, and God help us, we're the ones who have to teach her how to survive it." The sub-basement of the estate felt like the inside of a cold, steel heart. Far above, Zakai could hear the muffled echoes of the destruction, the glass shattering, the shouts of the law enforcement teams arriving to find a scene of biochemical warfare they weren't prepared to understand. But down here, in the lead-lined vault designed to withstand a nuclear strike, there was only the sound of 3 people breathing. Zakai sat on the floor, his back against the cold metal. The high-frequency shock had left him with a permanent tremor in his right hand, the one with the hawk, and a deep, aching fatigue that felt like it had reached his marrow. He watched Ifananya as she tended to Aloan. The girl was different now. Her eyes, once clouded by the gray fog of illness, were a piercing, luminous blue. She sat on a cot, breathing the filtered air of the vault with a rhythmic precision that was almost hypnotic. She wasn't afraid. She looked like someone who had just woken up from a very long, very dark dream and found the world wanting. "Vane says the data hit the servers," Zakai said, his voice a dry rasp. "Ethelgard's stock dropped 60% in the last hour. The CEO is in a private jet heading for a non-extradition country. The Lagos project is the lead story on every news cycle from London to Tokyo." Ifananya didn't look up from Aloan. She was wrapping a clean bandage around the cut on her own hand, the final sacrifice. "It won't stop them, Zakai. It will just drive them deeper into the shadows. They'll rebrand. They'll find a new name, a new face. But they'll always be looking for her." "Let them," Zakai said, his eyes narrowing. "I've burned my bridges. My assets are frozen. My business associates are running for cover, and my name is on a dozen watch lists. I have nothing left but this vault and the clothes on my back." He looked at the hawk on his hand. The ink was scarred now, a jagged line from the electrical burn running through the bird's wing. "But I have my daughter," he continued, "and I have the truth." Ifananya finally looked at him. The mask of the Maid was gone forever. She was a woman who had lost everything twice over, once in Lagos and once in Mina's shadow. But as she looked at Zakai, she saw a mirror of her own grief and her own determination. "You realize what happens now?" she asked. "We can't stay here. The government will want to study her just as much as Ethilgard did. We're fugitives, Zakai, not from the law, but from the species." Zakai stood up, his joints protesting. He walked over to the vault's heavy door and looked at the small monitor that showed the exterior of the estate. The Seattle fog was rolling in, thick and gray, swallowing the ruins of his empire. "I know a place," Zakai said. "In the mountains, no cameras, no electricity, just the air and the trees. My grandfather built it for a different kind of war, but it'll serve for this one." He reached out his hand, the scarred hawk to Ifananya. She hesitated for a second, then took it. Her grip was strong, the hand of a scientist and a survivor. "We'll need a doctor," Zakai said, a ghost of a smile appearing on his face. "And a man who knows how to hide in the dark." Eloin stood up and walked toward them. She took both of their hands, her small fingers interlaced with theirs. As she did, the lights in the vault flickered, a soft hum of resonance passing through the room. It wasn't a threat, it was a heartbeat. The mystery of the emotional mystery had reached its resolution, not with an answer, but with a new beginning. They were no longer the watchman, the maid, and the patient. They were a family forged in a laboratory of secrets and baptized in the fire of a corporate war. As they stepped out of the vault and toward the secret egress that would lead them into the rainy Seattle night, Zakai looked back one last time at the monitors. The house he had built, the fortress of surveillance and ink, was a ruin. The cameras were dark. The secrets were public. He didn't care. He took a deep breath, a long, healthy breath of the damp, cold air, and realized it was the first time in years he hadn't felt like he was suffocating. The hawk had left the nest. The mystery was gone. There was only the horizon and the long, difficult task of learning how to live in a world that was no longer their own.